I was very angry, I think, and very pessimistic as a 15-year-old. And I was actually pretty angry until I was 30. And, I really had a sense of foreboding doom about our culture and our society and kind of where we were going. I think there were a few moments when that shifted for me, a few moments of like pivot points, I guess. One is I got involved in the early blogging in the kind of right after 9/11 in 2002, 2003. And it was this moment of creativity. And I realized that you could actually participate in a public debate in a way that wasn't through these intermediaries who were credentialed. And I had really always believed in credentials and thought that they meant something. And it was blogging where I saw actually you can form different social structures. They are all malleable. And I sort of started to do more kind of entrepreneurial stuff around politics.
Welcome to A Life Worth Working. I'm Michelle Weiss.
And I'm Dana Allen Walsh.
Together we talk with guests who choose curiosity over cynicism, openness over fear, and who find purpose in the discipline of wonder.
In this episode, Matt Stoller, Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project and the author of the book Goliath, The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, discusses his crisis of faith as he worked for a member of the Financial Services Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives during the financial crisis.
I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. I was interested in business. I was interested in politics. I was interested in kind of all sorts of things, but I just didn't have any sense of where I fit in the world. I mean, there are all kind of moments when you realize, well, I guess another moment which was sort of similar was at that time when I was blogging and I was supportive of the war in Iraq, right? And I thought, well, I'm a smart guy, right? I went to Harvard. I did have this kind of fancy background. I did well on my SATs. And I went to the anti-war protests and I talked to people who were there. And I thought, well, they don't know what they're talking about. Look at the long hair or whatever it was that, all of the ways that you're taught to disrespect, ordinary people and common sense and just people with signs or shouting, all of the ways that we're taught to look at emotion and say that's a bad thing. And I went to the Institute of Politics and I listened to these fancy panels with dissidents from Iraq, and I listened to John Kerry and I read the New York Times, and I thought, well, all of these institutions are saying that not only do we need to be supportive of this war, but it's essential for for political reasons, right? Not even for moral reasons. And then I was like, I didn't like George Bush, but then a couple of months after the vote in 2002, I sort of realized, wait, this is really bad. And then a year into it, it was like, wait a second, I endorsed mass murder, right? And for like, what the fuck, right? And then the people who, Judith Mill at the New York Times didn't get fired until many years later. And most of the people that were supportive of this, that I had listened to, they stayed in their positions or they got promoted. And I thought that's really weird. And on a moral level, on a very personal level, I had validated myself based on all of the credentials I had accrued. But those credentials were given to me by people like that. And I was torn between this notion of, are you going to try to curry favor with people who are powerful, which is really how you get ahead as a kid. It's how I had gotten ahead as a kid. Or are you going to adhere to a sort of moral code that you're taught? And those were in opposition. And I had chosen the ambitious little shit approach.
Matt describes how conflicted he was as a Democrat when President Obama bailed out the biggest banks on Wall Street. He felt completely demoralized.
And I decided in 2008, I got politics, the way that I'd done elections, it doesn't work. I got to learn more. And I started to work in Congress. I was a staffer on the Financial Services Committee for a member of Congress. And it was a good place to learn about finance. And I learned a ton, but it was very depressing to see all of the people that you had, or a lot of the people that you had worked with, to realize that you had totally misjudged their fortitude in things like very obvious things. Like you thought, oh, well, torture is bad. Maybe people will be prosecuted for it. Or maybe we shouldn't do illegal surveillance, or all these things that you thought were generally like a consensus type of thing. And I was very upset and depressed for years after the financial crisis and then working on Dodd-Frank and just seeing the failure of the liberal establishment that I had been a part of. And then out of that came a kind of, all right, I'm going to look into history and try to understand why did we, how am I going to communicate to somebody who's coming into politics? Like when I went into Congress into the early 2009 or late 2008, I don't remember exactly when, but they said, look, here's a desk and an internet connection. Good luck with the financial crisis. And that was it. That was my orientation, right? And they were like, if you want to learn about banking, here's the banking lobbyist to teach you. I thought this is pretty fucked up. And I didn't have any sense of why any of the institution. I majored in history, right? I didn't know why the Securities and Exchange Commission existed. I didn't know why any of these bank regulators existed. And then you talk to these people, these agencies, these bank regulators, they didn't know either, right? Obama didn't know. So I eventually ended up, the one person who did know was this old economist. She was this woman who was like, oh yeah, the financial crisis, this thing's going to blow up now. And then it did. And then she's like, oh, this other thing's going to blow up now. And then it did. And they've all the lobbyists and the people from the Fed and Treasury, they didn't have any idea what was going on. But this old random economist woman did. Her name was Jane DeReese. And I said, how do you know all this? And she said, oh, I worked for this guy in the 60s and they took apart all the New Deal guardrails. So I knew where things were going to blow up. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And she worked for this guy named Wright Patman, who was known as the last populist. And then over the next couple of years, I read this book on monopolies, and it mentioned this law called the Robinson-Patman Act, which was about chain stores, constraining chain stores. And I thought, oh, Patman, that's that same guy. That's interesting. And so eventually I figured I wanted to write a book about why it wasn't Obama it wasn't just Obama, it was the Democrats had basically all supported this really terrible choice to consolidate wealth and power. And they didn't do it because they were corrupt. They thought it was the right thing to do. They were like, look, if you want to fix the banking system, you need to listen to bankers, right? Of course you just need, and that's what they thought. So I was like, why did they get that in their heads? Like, why couldn't they see that foreclosing on millions of people was a bad thing to do? And so I ended up saying, all right, what happened to the Democratic Party? And I did basically a biography, sort of a loose biography of this guy, Wright Patman, who had been, what I discovered is there's this whole tradition that I didn't know much about, which is the anti-monopoly tradition that goes back to the 1600s. You could go back earlier if you want, but we'll just go back to the 1600s. And, it's in every nook and cranny of American law and commerce is this anti-monopoly tradition. We just didn't know anything about it. And so I wrote this book called Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. And the idea was, this is the book I would have wanted to read to situate myself in 2009 when we had this financial crisis. And I guess that, there's some manure there. And then out of that grows a book that was modestly successful.
Matt had a full-on crisis of faith in the systems he was part of. And although at first he felt totally let down, he was able to fire up his own sense of curiosity. He went to the source to understand how these systems break down.
And through that work and deep research, he was able to create his best-selling book, Goliath, which centers on how unchecked economic power in concentrated corporate monopolies has shaped politics and undermined democratic life.
Matt, tell us what your work entails today.
So a lot of it is effectively business journalism. And it's a mix of business journalism and then political hackery, right? So I wear a number of hats, which is a cliche way of saying that I have one job that I sort of pretend and divide in multiple parts. I'm in DC. I'm at a think tank. It's a bullshit job. So what we do, I write a newsletter. It's called Big. And I also have a podcast called Organized Money. And what I do with those is I write about monopolies largely, but also finance. And kind of from the perspective of a populist, but someone who has some sense of how the law works. And I try to explain why the things that people are experiencing in their lives are the problems they experience are downstream from this tremendous consolidation of political and economic power, which has really happened since the 1970s because of some legal changes in how we organized antitrust law, finance, and regulatory policy. So, and that involves writing about antitrust cases. Antitrust is the specific body of law. There are other areas of law too. It also involves writing about companies. So the last entity I wrote about, I think in a serious way, was this company called Primo Brands. They are, like water coolers. Mm-hmm. They deliver water coolers, mm-hmm. and they've rolled up. They own every domestic spring water brand that's owned by a private equity company. And if you have some people just love having those water coolers, and the delivery is terrible. You can't get your water cooler refilled. It's like really bad now. And that's happened over the last 3 or 4 months. And the reason is because of a merger. And so I wrote that up, did a bunch of research and reporting, wrote the story, put it out, and sent it to my 150,000 readers. Another one was on fire trucks. There's been a roll-up of fire truck producers. So one of the reasons that the LA fires were so bad, and obviously not the only one, mostly it was, the climate and everything, but half of the fire trucks were in the boneyard because you've had a roll-up of fire truck makers, and now they're one of them, the major one is owned by a private equity company, and they make it really hard to get replacement parts for fire trucks. So fire departments are scavenging their own fire trucks for replacement parts. And so there's going to be a Senate hearing next month on it as a result of our work. And that's the kind of thing that I would do with Big, which is the newsletter that I run. And then I'm also at a think tank called the American Economic Liberties Project. And we're, I guess, about 15 to 20 people. And we write policy briefs for members of Congress, for state legislators, for, executive branch officials at a state and federal level, how to bring antitrust cases, how to do regulatory policy. So a recent one that we wrote, which was really fun, we have briefs on why electric utility bills are so high and how to address that. We also have something on, I know if anybody has a pet, do you guys either of you have pets? Mm-hmm. So going to the vet is more expensive than it used to be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've noticed that. And that's because you've had a corporate roll-up of veterinary practices. And so we wrote a bill that at a state level would ban corporate takeover of vet practices. Mm. And so it's stuff like that. And, the stuff that's like kind of making our lives more difficult, it's not just veterinary, it's not just pets, it's kind of everywhere. Mm-hmm. We try to give policymakers tools that they can use to take on corporate power with varying degrees of success. So this week, the judge in a court in DC is going to hand out a remedy decision on Google. It'll be front page news. He said August, so I'm assuming it's going to be today or tomorrow. Mm-hmm. These things can slip, but it'll be relatively soon. So that would be the big one. That's mm-hmm. Google, right? But there's a bunch of others, and we're trying to keep those alive in the Trump era with varying degrees of success.
Wow, Matt, I hear so much curiosity in your journey of just all the ways that from your own curiosity about yourself and your upbringing to then how that's impacted your career of politics and wearing multiple hats in the DC area. Would you talk about that role of curiosity in your career trajectory and what that's looked like?
Yeah, I mean, when I was little, my parents took me to museums a lot. And they, I did a lot of reading. I loved history. It's just really fun to learn. And I think that, my mom once said to me she took me to another museum, and I'm grateful they did it, but I didn't like it at the time. She said,
That's helpful to hear as parents.
no, and she also took me to carpet stores, and we just stayed there forever, and I don't know why. And I'm still mad about that.
Right. In the
I'm
time
still
of
mad.
wall carpet. Yes.
Yeah, it's really weird. Anyway, what do you do for 3 hours in a carpet store? Mom! If you can admit that you're not, that you don't know anything, that everybody is equal, and that you can be wrong about things, I think it's very empowering. It's also it can be depressing too, right? Because then you're not as confident. But that has given me the ability to sort of look at a lot of different industries and try to understand them. And if I don't understand them, then, I can't really write about them, because I have to defend whatever it is, I'm saying. That's one of the things about writing about monopolies, is that if you're writing about entities with a lot of money, and you're writing in a critical way, you better be right. Mm-hmm. Or at least it better not be embarrassing. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be embarrassingly wrong. Mm. And so that does give, especially if you're writing for a public audience. And so I think that has made it's made it really, it's important to understand that you can get things wrong, and that you have to really try to understand a situation before putting something out there. That curiosity is the basis for any sort of free society, right? Just a kind of basic understanding that we don't know what's going on in this world. We don't know a lot of what's going on, and we should just constantly be open to new information, and we should constantly be open to the idea that other people have a better sense of what's going on in their world than we do. And I think that's important in DC. Like, there was this really deep sense of confusion among the people that I dealt with in DC, saying, well, all of our numbers are saying that there's not a lot of inflation anymore. Why is the public so mad? What are they getting wrong? And my view is, if they think that prices are going up and our dials say they're not, my guess is our dials are broken, because they know, like, they have a sense for what's going on, what they are buying. And there were all these condescending ways of dismissing what other people were experiencing. And maybe people were wrong, really, really wrong, and have most of my career in politics. I don't think that's always been, but I think at this moment, I think it's from Iraq to the financial crisis to opioids. So I think bringing more humility to that is something that ultimately we're going to get to one way or the other, and it might be in a very ugly way.
Yeah. I like how you're describing this larger process, and it sounds like it kind of was a real existential crisis for you to go from sort of understanding the condescension and certitude that you were seeing in your environment and feeling within yourself, and then moving toward this more moral dimension in your work, right? And feeling that sense of intellectual humility. And I'm curious, if you look at what you do now and this idea of kind of really living into this sense of equality, which is hard and which can be depressing, do you sense that this feels like a kind of calling to you?
I think my view is that we are all we are divinely touched. I don't know how you can characterize that in any way, any religion, but our souls, I think, have a touch of the divine in them. And therefore, and that doesn't mean that we're good or bad, but it means that we, I think, have an obligation as moral beings. And, and I think everybody, I mean, if you look at how we structure our commerce, right, it's largely structured by economists. If a reporter wants to know, or a politician wants to know, what should we do about this thing involving money or power? Usually they'll talk to an economist. Sometimes they'll talk to a general. If you talk to, what is an economist? An economist is a certain type of moral reformer. In the 1880s, 1890s, it was the founding of the American Economics Association. The first meeting, roughly half of the members were Protestant ministers. And the whole idea of the social sciences in economics and the language of technocracy in which we're sort of living has a moral framework. And we maybe don't accept that it does, because it's sort of like saying, oh, I don't have an accent. I talk normal. But of course you do, right? And we are living in a world in which we have a basic understanding of what a human being means. My view is maybe more isolated, which is that I believe that every individual has a touch of the divine. I don't think that is generally. I don't think that most people in elite circles believe that. I don't think that they would say that that's not true. I don't think they think it very, very carefully or closely. But if you think about, there's a current debate about the Federal Reserve going on, right? Which is the bank that sets all of our interest rate policies and runs a lot of our economy. And there's this view that the Federal Reserve needs to be independent, untouched by politics, right? Because there was a very famous book on the Fed in the 80s called Secrets of the Temple, which is a religious, that's religious terminology. Alan Greenspan, he used to be known as the Oracle, right? This is all religious iconography. If you believe, I don't believe in Federal Reserve independence, right? Because that just means we listen to the, men in suits, and they ordain what we should do with our interest rates and credit and borrowing and whatnot. And because we, the people, are not good enough. Our elected leaders are too icky to do, to make these kinds of choices. And I think that's a very common view among elites, is we need to protect the independence of the Federal Reserve. And what that really means is that we have some people who can speak to God and some people who can't, right? And that and so I believe that everybody has a relationship with God directly. It's a very Puritan, go back to the Puritans. That's my view. And I think that is, maybe I'm transmogrifying lots of stuff. I'm sure you would, if you talk to people at the Fed, they'd be like, what the hell is he talking about? But that's my general observation. It is religious. And I do believe that. I'm Jewish. I've started to get into this thing called Daf Yomi, where we read a page of the Talmud, which is the sort of Jewish interpretation of the Torah, basically the comment section of the Torah. I read a page of that every day. And it's fun. It's very pedantic. But yeah, it's definitely religious. I definitely see myself as a religious sort of priest or something like that.
Matt's journey from being known as the knower of things to recognizing doubt and uncertainty is a humbling experience. But he's used his work to move away from that certitude and embrace curiosity and intellectual humility.
It reminds me of something Malcolm Gladwell realized, too. Gladwell now points to his hubris as a young writer striving to write a book for the ages. And in his own certainty, he had been dead wrong about stop-and-frisk policies in his book, The Tipping Point. These are his words. I wrote, I know this is what happened. And what I should have said is, this is what I believe happened now. Right? And those words, I believe happened now, have to be at the center of any understanding of how the world works. We have to acknowledge that we are representing the position of this very moment, and that position could change if the facts change, right?
This is what I believe happened. This is what I believe to be true now, today. I think both writers are highlighting how curiosity can lead us into more of an interrogative approach, rather than quick moves to sweeping claims.
And it's worth dwelling in that space of uncertainty.
If you want to learn more about Matt Stoller, you could find his Substack newsletter called Big, and also listen to his podcast with David Dayan called Organized Money.
Don't forget to subscribe to A Life Worth Working, rate our show, and share it with the people you love.
Because together, we're all searching for the soul of work.